Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I am again joined by Right Ruminations to discuss the reinterpretation of the American Revolution within Straussian terms. So why don't you frame this discussion for us here?
So, at the time of the American Revolution, there was a sense in which each of the 13 colonies seceded separately, and for the most part, they articulated their reasons for leaving Great Britain on the basis of English legal theory. If you look at speeches given by Patrick Henry, for example, there is the idea that there is this constitutional compact with the British, and because the British weren't living up to that, that the Americans were then justified in withdrawing from that compact and seceding, essentially. Um, and this is something that the American South during the American Civil War would go on to point to as an example of why they themselves were justified in seceding, namely that the federal government in Washington was not holding up its end of the constitutional bargain on a number of different counts, and that they were therefore justified in withdrawing from the Union. However, Lincoln, in the Gettysburg Address, clearly outlines a different theory as to what happened, which looks a lot more like the Lockean Enlightenment theory that justifies revolution, which is that the Americans formed a kind of unitary nation on the basis of natural rights justification, and that the South should not be allowed to secede because it was itself in violation of the rights of men in a way analogous to the British Empire. In other words, Lincoln sort of stood the problem on its head. And then with the Straussian philosopher, political scientist, Henry Jaffa, there was a further articulation of what Lincoln was thought to have meant, which is that the American revolutionaries actually had a revolution in the colonies, wherein they did not so much secede as individual colonies, but they actually overthrew the king in the colonies and replaced him with new revolutionary governments. So in the Lincoln Jaffa model, it looks less like a secession that is a response to a violation of a gentleman's agreement, and looks more like a kind of revolution that is like what the French had, where they actually overthrew the king and replaced it with something else. Now, the reason that this relates to the philosopher Leo Strauss, who was a mentor of Harry Jaffa, is that Strauss had this idea of America as this kind of uniquely virtuous nation that was not so much based on English legal precedent, but was based on like these Aristotelian Platonic ideas of universal virtues and values, and the kind of rhetoric that you see passed down to the neoconservatives and neoliberals today. I think that the practical effect of this difference is that it's redrawn America's purpose as being a defender of universal values worldwide. So it is not America's place as an advocate of freedom is not as a kind of defensive union that wants to keep out political power, but rather it is a vehicle of God's will, or of the philosopher's will, to bring about a kind of original vision of society. And this is also something that has even caught traction in some paleoconservative circles. A few years back, Dan McCarthy, who's the editor of The American Conservative, wrote an article saying that actually the American Revolution didn't involve any secession, but rather that it involved the overthrowing of King George III in the territory of the American colonies, which is a more abstractive and I think less plausible explanation. Though, in fairness, I will give credit where credit is due, that some of the American founding fathers did think that their colonies did revert temporarily to a state of nature before reforming a social contract. So at times, Patrick Henry does speak of Virginia having done this, even though at other times he makes the case that an English jurist would make, that it was a kind of act of secession. Jefferson, on the other hand, who's, I think, decidedly a more important voice among the founding fathers, thought that Virginia did not enter into a state of nature and that it was a clear-cut secession. This is the basic framework and the gist of the tension between the secessionist versus the Straussian school of thought on what the American Revolution was actually about.
Well, what's interesting is when you unpack Straussian theory, he had this idea of esoterically reading the great works, and you read them in distinction from their historical context, because they accused people who read the great works in the historical context of committing the fallacy of historicism, rather that you should read these works almost analogous to the way fundamentalists read the Bible, as a sort of an access to timeless truths. And the other thing as well is, he argued that because Athens judiciously murdered Socrates, that all philosophers wrote in code afterwards, beginning with Plato. And I guess he was the guy that figured out how to do it. And so when you read Locke or the Founding Fathers or Thomas Aquinas or Plato, you can't read them at face value. You have to read their you can't read them exoterically, or what it says on the surface. That's historicism. You have to read it esoterically. Now, what's interesting is you sort of hinted at how this dovetails with the alt-right. Greg Johnson, who you didn't mention in your introductory video, taught philosophy professionally, and he was a Straussian. He says straight up, and shortly after Countercurrents was uploaded to the internet, he had a list of lectures he gave on philosophy. It was saying that, we should read them esoterically as these absolute truths. Very big on Aristotle. So it was odd that this ethno-nationalist would essentially take the philosophy of a Jewish intellectual as the way he interprets the great courses and the great books. But I think the main weakness of this interpretation is precisely the fact that you cannot ignore the historic context. Well, what this really just sounds like to me is postmodernism infiltrating the right. It's not quite postmodernism, I know, because truth is not subjective to the reader. It's in some Platonic realm. But what ends up happening is it becomes de facto subjective to the reader. Because do we have any decoder ring to figure out when his philosopher is speaking eso or exoterically? No, I mean, I've never seen the decoder ring. So to me, it might as well be an individual preference that's being pursued here. And I also find it difficult to believe and presumptuous to argue that the psychological state of mind of a man who wrote hundreds of or thousands of years ago better than he does. If one founder said that they were seceding from a gentleman's agreement, there's no reason not to take him at face value when he says this. Now, of course, if you believe in an indivisible union, like a lot of Lincolnians do, you see why they would take a Straussian position, because it allows them to exert that reading of U.S. history back to the beginning. But it just seems completely ad hoc to me.
It's interesting that you bring up Greg Johnson, because I actually watched a Richard Spencer stream where he admitted to being a Straussian explicitly, because he thought that it was a good idea to actually say one thing and mean another, and actually practice esotericism intentionally in the present day. So in Spencer's case, what he was saying is that he wanted to exoterically support freedom of speech, even though esoterically he's actually opposed to freedom of speech in his preferred society. Now, that just as a footnote, that seems a rather strange thing to admit online on a public stream if what you want is to be an esotericist. But maybe he just wants to be seen as an esotericist. I'm not sure. But it is true. I agree with your objection that it's not really possible to know what these people meant. And obviously, I do think that there is esotericism in the writings of the great authors throughout history. I don't dispute that. I think that that seems rather plausible. But at the same time, why would you think that their esoteric intentions are your esoteric intentions when what you are reading into it, and you can really see this with the Jaffa thesis, is something which is indeed informed by your own historical prejudices and circumstances. In this way, I think that there is an odd kind of historicism in the Straussian position because it is necessarily anachronistic. I don't really see that as being much of a way of getting around that. In other words, Plato and Aristotle all but admitted that they did have esoteric intentions in some cases, but I'm pretty sure it didn't have anything to do with neoconservatism or America being a vessel for the spreading of Enlightenment values. I don't really think it would have had much to do with that. Also, I think that if you want to be this very critical person who's reading between the lines and who is looking for hidden intent, that's fair. You can do that on the one hand, but you have to also be willing to focus on the historical circumstances because that defined the audience that they were writing for, what they may have had on their mind. So at the very least, you have to keep an eye to the exoteric in addition to the esoteric if you want to be doing good scholarship. I think that with respect to Jefferson and what the founding fathers said, they are not so much reading into them esoteric intent. What they are doing more so is kind of almost reading an unknown or an unconscious esoteric intent, wherein the kind of spirit of the nation was manifesting itself with the founders unawares or being kind of unwitting historical participants, which actually makes it sound rather Hegelian. And Hegel is not an unknown figure or an unknown influence with respect to the Straussians, although they have their complaints about him as well. So in the case of the American Revolution, it's not so much that they're reading esoteric intent into any particular thinker, so much as it is that they are making an evaluation of what it was really all about subconsciously.
Yeah, and that's where it gets a bit dicey. Now, certainly, I will freely admit that certain schools of philosophical thought were exoteric by definition. For example, Neoplatonism with Plotinus, Porphyry, and Iamblichus. Also, some of the secret societies like Rosicrucians and whatnot. Sure, but all of them and they're all on it together, doubtful. If anything, there's probably multiple independent esoteric streams, and it's not even clear that those are the ones that are going to be held by Leo Strauss. But what I find interesting here is Leo Strauss is sort of zeroing in on a certain interpretation of history as it pertains to philosophy. Socrates has two basic biographers, both of whom are favorable. Plato, which is more of a philosopher, and then Xenophon, who's more of a historian, more specifically a military historian, both of whom were students of Socrates, and both of whom had a very sympathetic view of him. But one of the things that I've noticed, and I didn't notice this when I was taking the philosophy courses because they don't teach the history behind it, but they make it sound like Socrates was just, this guy that was just poking too many beehives and finally got, hung for it by a bunch of the mob. But what I think is, it's kind of odd because all of these people would sort of oppose the sort of left-wing mob and the university professor who eggs them on. But in many ways, that left-wing professor who creates the mob is sort of more true of Socrates than it is of the Athenian state. So Socrates' students were active collaborators with Sparta's dictatorship after the Peloponnesian War with the 30. And in typical tyrannical lefty fashion, they just summarily executed all sorts of, quote, enemies of the state, unquote. And the best that the defenders of Socrates can say is that he didn't actively support them. That seems like it seems like Bernie Sanders saying, well, I disapprove of the Bernie bros, but I'm not going to disown them. I mean, in a lot of ways, the historical Socrates has more in common with a left-wing professor than he does with any sort of like, true North right-wing, by the book kind of guy. And it does seem an odd interpretation for them to take, given how vehemently they disagree with the left in academia.
Well, I think that one thing that would distinguish Socrates from the modern left is the fact that he was legitimately voicing opinions that were unpopular in the context of his society. I think that what the left has today and what the mob on college campuses has today is behind them the support of the establishment in many cases. And they're not really communists in the sense that say a dissident in the 1950s on a college campus might have been a communist. That is, culturally, they clearly have a kind of approval or backing of the people who are in power. Whereas I think that Socrates was actually, to his credit, endangering himself. But I also take the point that with respect to older lefts, there's an analogy between themselves and Socrates. And this brings to mind, actually, something that was pointed out to me the other day, is that Christian conservatives often give Socrates a kind of free pass and Plato a kind of free pass as being these antecedents to Christianity, as if they were somehow, because they predated Christian revelation, as if they were as close to the truth as you could get at the time. Whereas the reason that doesn't entirely hold up is because around the same time you have Confucius writing in the Far East, who actually comes much closer to modern Christian and certainly modern conservative traditionalist right-wing perspectives that these people might be supportive of. And so I think that you are correct that it would be wrong-headed for these people to claim Socrates and Plato's as steadfast antecedents to their own endeavors.
Well, the other thing to point out, too, is I'm not alone in this view that Plato is a sort of like proto-leftist agitator. Bertrand Russell, in his History of Western Philosophy, admits that we should take his ideal city, the Callipolis, essentially planned communist state, at face value as his idea of the good society. Aristotle does the same in his Politics. And of course, Ayn Rand has an earful about Plato being a radical. And even the sort of New Deal leftist, I can't think of his name. There was a certain in the 90s, Lyndon LaRoche, the New Deal leftist. He also sort of viewed Plato as this radical agitator. Now, I think he liked Plato and viewed Aristotle as the fuddy-duddy. But whether you like Socrates for this reason or dislike him for this reason, Socrates and Plato really have more of a lefty subversive vibe than they do a sort of conservative, stable vibe. In fact, one of my philosophy professors said, when students first read Plato, it's like they got a hold of rock and roll for the first time. And when they first read Aristotle, it's like when they first listen to a piece of classical music.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. And I think that this is one of the reasons that a lot of left-wing traditionalists, like these "'twas ever thusers" that we've discussed in the past, are all over Plato. They absolutely love him, like David Bentley Hart. I think Rod Dreher is a fan of Plato. That you have these kind of these high church hipsters that we've talked about, there's a reason that they love Plato so much, and I think it might actually be there might be a commonality between them and the neocons in this, in that or the Straussians in this, in that they like Plato because it kind of is a way of maintaining conservative bona fides while maintaining a framework that is in keeping with their universalist leftist claims. So I would say that maybe this is a good time to point out that we can lay at their feet the greatest insult imaginable from their perspective by saying that the high church hipsters and the neocons have more in common with one another than they would ever like to admit.
Yeah, but I think that the sort of more constructionist interpretation of the Constitution, which we also saw with a lot of libertarians during the Ron Paul years. Tom Woods comes to mind, Robert DiLorenzo, who also debated Harry Jaffa on just that issue of the original construction of the Constitution, and was the South legitimate in leaving. He takes the gentleman's agreement position that yes, it was, and just as it was legitimate to leave the British Empire, it was also legitimate to leave the Union because the South viewed the Union, the northern states, as acting against their self-interest. And Jaffa was like, no. The original revolution was about natural rights, absolute right and wrong in this cosmic sense. And slavery was cosmically wrong, so the South could never be on the right side. That's kind of interesting, of course, because it was the British Empire that pursued a policy of emancipation during the Revolution to woo slaves away in the South as they were marching up with Cornwallis. But again, back to what I think the main issue here is, I don't see how this is functionally different than postmodernism, in the sense that, yes, unlike postmodernists, they do agree there is a capital T truth out there in the world, but it's hidden, it's exoteric. And so how exactly am I supposed to double check your subjective feeling of what Lincoln or Jefferson was really getting at? In actual practice, it really doesn't amount to anything different than, a leftist saying that mathematics is a white fascist construct.
I guess that the biggest difference between this perspective and the postmodern perspective is, as you say, that one supports, does believe in a universal truth, or at least some kind of natural law, and the other one does not. However, there's also just the point that one is looking for, and there may be a kind of horseshoe going on here, but nominally they should be opposites. And the reason that they should be opposites is that the postmodern view is the idea that the contexts are so complex and the contexts are so affect the meaning or perceived meaning of a given text that we can never know its meaning. Whereas in the Straussian frame of mind, it's kind of the opposite, in that what it is saying is that there is a kind of fast and fixed meaning, and that essentially the circumstances, cultural, historical circumstances, do not matter. So what I would say is that postmodernism is by necessity ultra-historicist, whereas the Straussian model is explicitly anti-historicist. But the reason that they, in practice, can seem the same is because both of them are, and I wonder if there is a proper, a really satisfactory term for this. I want to say that they are both subjective, in that they are both, they are both what Ayn Rand would accuse of being idealistic. That is, that they are both viewing truth as something which is attributable by the mind of the observer. And so even though the Straussians are absolute and the postmodernists infinitely malleable, in both cases, there is this kind of solipsistic tendency in which the truth is something that comes from within rather than from without.
Exactly. But I think we can see, though, at least within the context of the Jaffa Di Lorenzo debate, why this is so important. Because if it was as a sort of original intent reading of the Constitution and the secession of 1776 would indicate, these were essentially independent nations confederating to withdraw from the British Empire. And that was the argument many Southerners were making at the time. And Lincoln was like, no, we can't have that. One nation, indivisible. And so Jaffaites, in order to defend this position, if you could make that stick, that the founders really were in this almost in Hegelian sense, bringing out the true spirit of what the United States was or should be. In that sense, it's somewhat transcendent, and if it can be made to stick, it's kind of a trump card. But I just don't think you can make it stick because precisely it's so esoteric. It's a little more than just say so, your say so, trust me, I'm not lying. And I'm like, I'm not saying you're lying. How could you even know this?
Right. I think that one of the problems is that much like with Lincoln, I think that the founders had, maybe by necessity, a serious pragmatic streak. So very often what the founding fathers said seemed hopelessly convenient to the point that it can often obscure the circumstances of what they did. So, for example, you have people like Samuel Adams saying things like, we are standing for the natural rights of Englishmen. Well, what on earth does that mean? That's basically gibberish. And this kind of language is repeated, and it does do a disservice, I think, a kind of contemporary disservice to what was going on. Nevertheless, despite these difficulties in the rhetoric with which the revolutionaries talked about their own cause, what I would say is that the ultimate product of their endeavors, being the U.S. Constitution, comes out decidedly on the gentleman's agreement thesis, in that the Declaration of Independence, which would lend the most credence to the Jaffa Strauss interpretation, does not actually have any legal authority. There is no legal power with the Declaration of Independence, and indeed it didn't actually do anything legally. It didn't even achieve independence. All the states had already seceded from the Union. Furthermore, the Constitution actively precludes, or did preclude originally, any kind of Straussian reading of the Declaration of Independence, in that the Bill of Rights was a federal institution that bound the federal government from really doing very much at all to supersede state laws, except in a very select few enumerated cases. So I think that if you are going to be honest about what the often contradictory rhetoric of the American revolutionaries amounts to, I think you have to look ultimately at what they actually did and what they actually decided to write down into law as to what would be the practical fruits of their revolution. And it is, I think, incontrovertible that the document that came out of the Philadelphia Convention was absolutely the kind of arrangement that the paleo-conservatives and the paleo-libertarians want to look back on, and really has nothing in common at all with the kind of FDR, Ronald Reagan interpretation that the Straussians want to read into it.
Yeah. Now, one interesting aspect here is you've already brought up, and I've already brought up, how this kind of interpretation of American history and the history of the great ideas has influenced dissident right thinkers. So the idea, I think you in your video called it a Jacobining of the American Revolution. We definitely see that attitude amongst many of the dissident right, that the American Revolution was a proto-Jacobin endeavor, that it was not really ever conservative or moderate or pragmatic. And it's a very Jaffian, Straussian position. I think it gets harder to maintain in light of the actual course of directions the French Revolution took and the actual course of direction the United States Revolution took. And by extension, we can also include the revolutions in Latin America from 1810 to 1830. And the Venezuelan man of letters, Carlos Rangel, pointed out that unlike his revolutions or France's revolution, the American Revolution was fundamentally moderate in its goals and desires. It was preserving an already existing society, which had been born out of benign neglect. And the Latin American revolutions and the French Revolution were trying to create a new society that had not previously existed. And the Latin American revolutions are a bit interesting, though, in that they try to be both French and American. They all try to have U.S. constitutions, try to imitate U.S. life, but they're also inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution, and they bear more in common with the French Revolution when it comes to the brutality of reactionaries versus revolutionaries. And I'm thinking that when you do have that confusion in language, I think you're right. You have to look at what they actually did rather than what they said. And I think it's harder to claim that the American Revolution or the English Revolution of 1688 or even the Dutch Revolution of the 1580s were Jacobin. They might have been radical, and I wouldn't say that they weren't per se, but they weren't Jacobin revolutions. I think there's a tendency amongst the dissident right that if any ideology is the cause of radical change in the world or in the nation, that they must all be the same. So Luther is the same as Marx because they were revolutionaries that radically changed the social order. But I mean, by the same token, Constantine was a Marxist revolutionary because he radically changed the pagan society. It's not a very, I think, well thought out position.
Well, I think it is true that in this sense, people like Richard Spencer are Straussians. They're simply anti-American Straussians. So if the neoconservative Straussians, like Harry Jaffa, read into this the American Revolution, this kind of subconscious intent, and then say that this is why America should be this way, rather with Richard Spencer and others like him, it is America, in his view, as America is today, it is bad. And since its spirit was already implicitly present in the American Revolution, therefore the American Revolution is bad too. Now, there are a couple of problems with this. One is that it fails to compare what America looks like today versus what the places that either didn't have revolutions of the American variety or had revolutions that are decidedly distinct from the American variety look like. That is, Great Britain and Australia and Canada, many of the places that didn't leave the United States, are decidedly more radical in terms of the culture of political correctness and so forth. So there is not really any empirical reason to think that if the United States hadn't left Great Britain, that it would have been in some ways less radical than it is, especially considering, now it would have looked different to an extent, but this is especially true considering that these radical ideas that manifested here and there in other ways were already afoot in the European Western world more generally. Another problem is that, and this is something that the neo-reactionaries also have a problem with, in terms of this idea of what leads to what, in terms of historical cycles. And the reason that this is a problem is because everything leads to everything. If you believe in the reality of historical cycles, which probably does have some veracity, it doesn't really do to say, well, this led to that, therefore this was bad, because the idea is eventually then the bad thing will lead to some kind of reaction, which is ultimately good. And there's no particular, it's very chicken and egg. There's no particular reason for saying that, well, this is the bad part of the cycle or this is the good part of the cycle. That is the attribution of cyclical developments to history is something which is purely descriptive. And since at some point everything leads to everything, there is not really any reason for attributing any qualities of good or bad to that. It's simply the observation of a particular development. And in that spirit, I'm not sure that the American Revolution is responsible for how it developed over 200 years later. And B, insofar as it is responsible, it's not entirely clear that America is worse off than any of the places that didn't secede from the British Empire. This is something that...
Well, real quick, just to interject again, a classic point would be Canada. Canada didn't leave the British Empire, and yet it's far more progressive and SJW and degenerate by dissident right standards than the United States is.
Yes, I would agree with that, and I brought that example up a moment ago. I think that the last point that I would make on this, and the reason I think it's kind of silly and does a disservice to the founding fathers, is that at the end of the Philadelphia Convention, Benjamin Franklin, who supported the adoption of the Constitution as a replacement for the Articles of Confederation, said, "I expect this thing to fail in 200 years. And I still support it because we should not expect political institutions to be infallible." And so there was no expectation that it was going to remain a perfectible arrangement, or that it was going to deliver some kind of utopia, which I think is a good counter-argument to the alt-right Straussians, who want to accuse the American Revolution of modern degeneracy, and is also a good counter-argument against the Straussians, who claim that it is some kind of sacred political arrangement that was meant to last forever.
Well, yeah, and I think what's kind of interesting as well is how the reactionaries and the alt-right in general, because they've adopted this, I guess for lack of a better word, right-wing Straussianism, have earned the name reactionary. They're still accepting the basic underlying intellectual principles of a perceived left-wing side and just taking the opposite position. And I think this is a problem that the dissident right has had for a long time. It is consistently reactive to what the left has. They say, okay, what does the left say is bad? And we'll just say it's good. And this kind of gets into what Keith Preston calls this sort of transgressiveness, compulsory transgressiveness. And it's like, I mean, okay, sure, you might be able to make case-by-case arguments for why all these things are actually good. But we know that's not why you believe them. If some other set of ideas triggered the left or triggered normie conservatives, then you would just take those.
Yes, I don't have much more to add on that point. If you'd like to move on to what's next on the agenda.
Sure. The other thing is with well, I guess we could use this to look into the relegation of the neoconservative movement and Straussianism in public square to a sort of secondary status. Obviously, the sort of foreign policy package that the neoconservatives invested themselves in from Bill Clinton till Barack Obama failed, massively failed. And with the Trump revolution, they were sort of homeless. They weren't quite ready to go full DNC. They probably won't now because it's in all likelihood Bernie Sanders will take the nomination. And so they're kind of politically homeless. They constantly counter-signal Trump, but at the end of the day, though, they have become increasingly irrelevant. And one could argue that it was their failed policy on foreign affairs. That's part of it. But I think also they were just too esoteric, too subjective, and it was difficult for them to get a lot of people to rally behind their beliefs. I mean, what is the spirit of America? It sounds very Hegelian, very opaque. What do these eternal truths look like? I'm sure they could give an account that's sophisticated and at least consistent within their worldview, but they really did not have the capacity to bring that to the people in a way that I guess you could say esoteric Christianity did, like with the Rosicrucians or other groups like the Freemasons. They were more successful, but I think yes, the actual public failure of their policies, but also they were just too esoteric, and they almost became irrelevant for that reason.
Well, it's actually kind of impressive in a sense that the neoconservatives were able to get so much success for so long. It's funny that from maybe the late 70s up until really up until Trump, the neoconservatives did manage to create a kind of populist facade. You had it with the way Ann Coulter used to be, with kind of what Fox News still does look like to a great extent, but certainly very much looked like during the George W. Bush and Obama years. You had it with the kind of moral majority, with Newt Gingrich, with a lot of what happened in the Bush administration, but just in like things you'd hear every day on talk radio, like with Mark Levin or with Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity or that Mormon fellow. And I think that Glenn Beck is his name. And I think that it's kind of amazing that these, and maybe, I suppose, in a sense, Peloponnesian almost, you might say, that these aims, which I think are so extrinsic to what would be in the interest of everyday American people, managed to gain a kind of populist traction in the mind of this sort of truck driver populist culture. But I suppose when everyday life became a little bit more difficult, that it was not destined to last forever.
I will say this in defense of the neoconservatives. Back to the sort of parsing of political philosophy that Leo Strauss had, that the ancient philosophers were better than the modern philosophers. Whether one wants to go that far, there had been a negligence of classical philosophy in the academy at that time. And it was to Leo Strauss's credit that this sort of classicist mindset became more popular. In fact, in popular culture, this corresponds with movies like Troy or 300, where classical themes are elevated in popular culture. You obviously have Victor Davis Hanson, who made allusions between the Peloponnesian War and Thebes and Sparta and contemporary policy. They may not have been the best analogies, but it did bring them into public consciousness. And you had others. I think there was Gates of Fire. That was a popular neoconservative-ish, classicist-oriented book. And ultimately, unfortunately, that effort to sort of revivify classical thinking and to bring the classics back to the people ultimately failed, because we have now universities across the nation, kicking out the classics, creating, new classics of all these minorities and all of this stuff. And in many ways, it was a kind of heroic failure to try to reclaim the Western tradition, at least a certain interpretation of it, one that maybe we don't all agree with. But it doesn't hurt when people read Aristotle, when people read, the Iliad, but they're not even reading that apparently.
I agree that the best thing about the Straussians, and actually this is something that is the best thing about the high church hipsters as well, is their devotion to the Great Books program. So credit where credit is due. I mean, at the very least, perhaps they have given more opportunities than would have otherwise existed for everyday people to, or at least reasonably educated people to have access or have cause to read these texts. And I think that this is one of the reasons that of all these complaints against the Straussians, the strongest that I've heard from Noam Chomsky is that Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind, was mind-bogglingly stupid because it was telling people what to read, which Chomsky thought was just this deplorable position. So, if for that reason, contra Chomsky, we need to give credit where credit is due and say that the best thing that's come out of both the Twas Ever Thusers and the Straussians is the attempt to preserve the liberal arts curriculum.
Yes, and ultimately, when I went in my formative years, this sort of I did appreciate this sort of classic orientation. This was back when the History Channel actually covered history, and so they covered ancient Greece and Rome, some classic documentaries from that period, and there was a general awareness of classical ideas that is fundamentally not present anymore. And I think another thing that can be said in favor of these Straussians, something that would offend them and probably offend the people I'm going to name, is they gave rise to the dissident right. People like Greg Johnson and Richard Spencer, for all of their flaws, have really sort of expanded our consciousness of how to view the world, and they did it through a kind of Straussian analytical lens. And so I think I've made both of them upset at the same time as well.
I think that one of the reasons that these esotericists have had such an influence on people like Greg Johnson and Richard Spencer is actually because they're interesting writers. And I think that maybe the reason that I have, say, been drawn to them, maybe you could even get, say, Richard Spencer to admit, is just because it is extraordinarily entertaining to read about, the presence of the chapel at the threshold of the Grail Gate, and like the sacrifice of the Grail Maiden in order to pass through various existential phases of existence. And it's like, my goodness, I have no idea what this means, but it's great to read.
Yeah, that's true too. I think it's very, very trippy. But I guess if there is a legacy to the neoconservatives, one would be the sort of last gasp of a kind of consensus American nationalism, where we all rally around the American nation state. This sort of predates, not, beginning in the 90s. Bill Lynn starts talking about fourth generation warfare and how the nations are going to fragment, and people are going to have loyalties to non-state institutions. And you look at Harry Jaffa, and even when he debated Di Lorenzo, he was a bit of a dinosaur, representing a consensus that no longer existed. And it seems to me their intended goal was to preserve that consensus, which by the time they came to power, I think was already beginning to disintegrate. They objectively failed.
Right. I think it should be noted that there are other antecedents to this interpretation of the American legacy that are mixed with Straussianism. In fact, it really goes back to the Jacksonians. And if you want to go back before the Jacksonians, the Puritans before that there has always been a kind of, you might say, salvific quality or strand of thinking that has existed in the American experiment. But I think that practically speaking, I think where it starts to take off is with the Jacksonians and James Polk and the idea of manifest destiny. I think is something which the Lincoln shift cannot be properly stood without taking into account. That is not only is the Straussian interpretation of the American Revolution not something that can be understood without reference to Lincoln, but I think that even the Lincolnian interpretation of America cannot be understood without reference to the Jacksonians and other developments that had happened beforehand. So I think that neoconservatism, maybe in terms of its most direct pedagogical or intellectual influence, Straussian, it is Straussian with an admixture of these other, maybe more quintessentially American intellectual or political strands, historical strands. And I think it's because of that admixture that the Straussian message has managed to cultivate more of a populist appeal, at least up until recently. And I think that the Jacksonian influence is a large part of what has kind of helped to form maybe the feeling of the populist face of neoconservatism.
Well, we're nearing about the end of the hour. Is there any final statements you'd like to leave us with?
The final statement would be that the Straussian interpretation, and more particularly the Harry Jaffa interpretation of the American Revolution, is essentially untenable in terms of what the original documents and the original circumstances of the American Revolution suggest. Namely, that the states seceded individually, that they did so by way of justification through the English common law, and that the document which would most vindicate the Straussian position, namely the Declaration of Independence, was given no legal standing, and indeed was not even thought to be that important at the time. Indeed, the only reason that Jefferson was the one who wrote the Declaration of Independence was because Adams didn't think it was important enough and handed it down to Jefferson for authorship. We cannot know anything about what the founding fathers intended, nor is there any reason to, beyond the most obvious, nor is there any reason to think that they intended anything other than what they did. In that spirit, I think that it is quite clear that the paleoconservative and libertarian interpretation of the American Revolution is the more historically valid one, and the Straussian interpretation is clearly an anachronistic interpretation or imagined fantasy as to what they would prefer the American Revolution be rather than what it actually was.
In that regard, I would substantially agree. This is Todd Lewis of the President's Folly Podcast, signing off.